This invitation. I'm very pleased to be here. I'm afraid I'm going to have this in my hand the whole way through because they don't design these microphone power packs for women and I have nothing else to do with it, which may affect my gesticulation, but I hope it won't affect the quality of the talk. So I'm going to talk about the effects of kin on women's fertility rates. If you look at human women, at least compared to other primates, then human women have a real problem. And this is that problem. Human children are a real problem for human women. They require a lot of investment compared to at least the other great ape children, infants. Women organise their reproduction quite a different way to other great ape mothers. Another great ape mother, like the gorilla, would give birth to an infant, would lactate for a certain number of years. But when the infant was weaned, the infant would be nutritionally at least entirely independent of the mother. The same is true for most other ape and monkey species. Not all, but most of them. This is not true for human children. These children are weaned. They were weaned some time ago. These are kids from the Gambia, but they're clearly not nutritionally entirely independent. They still need quite a lot of care, quite a lot of feeding because of this quite complex subsistence niche or subsistence niches that the human species tends to adopt. So you have the situation where women are caring for multiple dependent children simultaneously. And this puts a very heavy burden of care on human mothers compared to many other primate mothers, and mammalian mothers for that matter. This is exacerbated by another feature of the human reproductive system. So this is quite a famous diagram from Schwartz, comparing the life history of a number of different female primates. You have macaque, lesser ape, gibbon, the chimpanzee and the human. You can see in terms of total lifespan there's quite a difference between these species, but in terms of reproductive lifespan, humans have quite an unusual reproductive lifespan as well. The vertical bars there represent the length of the reproductive lifespan in these different species. The human reproductive lifespan in absolute length is not too different from the other ape species, other monkey species. It's a little bit shorter than the chimpanzee reproductive lifespan, but what is quite unusual about human children is that they come along quite rapidly. The interbirth interval in humans in natural fertility populations is something like 3 years or so. So children are coming along really quite quickly compared to other, again, at least great ape species, where children tend to come along a bit more slowly. Chimpanzee infants come along at about 4-year intervals, gorilla infants maybe 5-year intervals, orangutans have very lengthy birth intervals, they have 8-year birth intervals. So compared to other great ape species, human women also have children that come along quite rapidly. This adds to this burden of multiple dependent children. You have this stacking of offspring that you don't really see in other primate species. And people like Sarah Hrdy have suggested the solution to this problem is that humans are cooperative breeders, that mothers can't bear this heavy burden of care alone, but they need to get help from other individuals in order to subsidise their own reproduction. And I'm going to use the term cooperative breeding in a fairly loose sense here. It's a system which is not that common across other species. It's most common in bird species. About 10% of bird species are cooperative breeders. This is a system in which mothers receive help from others in order to raise their offspring. It's rarer in mammalian species. There are a handful of mammalian species that do it, including a couple of primate species, or rather the marmosets and tamarins. Some of those are cooperative breeders in South America. And I'm using cooperative breeding here in quite a loose sense. I simply mean it's a system in which mothers are receiving help from other individuals in order to raise their offspring. There has recently been a bit of a debate in the literature that the term cooperative breeding should be restricted to systems where the helpers are, where it involves some kind of reproductive suppression, where the helpers are damaging their own reproduction, if you like, in order to help mothers out to raise their children. That's not the sense in which I use the term cooperative breeding. I simply mean mothers are getting help from other individuals. They can't do it alone, essentially. Now, for a long time, the suggestion in the literature was that the solution to women's problems was in fact men, that it was paternal investment that was essentially underwriting women's reproduction. For a long time, it was thought that a number of unique features of human evolution, in fact, were related to this very intensive, very universal paternal investment that was supposedly seen in our species. I'm not convinced of that at all. I entirely agree that paternal investment is relatively heavy in human species. Again, certainly if you compare us to the great apes, where males don't do much, certainly direct investment at all. However, I think the importance of paternal investment is sometimes perhaps overemphasised. It's not just fathers that women are getting help from, it's their wider social circle, their wider kin networks that women are getting help from in order to raise children. And I tried to look at this empirically recently by reviewing the literature on child survivorship and the impact of kin on child survivorship. Throughout this talk, when I say kin, I'm actually including fathers in that. I'm using the mother as the unit of interest the whole time, rather than the parents of the unit of interest. So a cooperative breeding system is one in which mothers are getting help from other individuals. That may be the father, but it may be other members of the social group as well. So this review of the literature, the existing published literature out there on the impact of various relatives on child survivorship, suggests to me that while paternal investment is clearly substantial in some cases, in 1/3 of studies, the absence of the father resulted in higher child mortality rates. It clearly doesn't appear to be important in all societies, as in 2/3 of studies there was no effect at all of the loss of the father on child survivorship. It suggests to me that if paternal investment is so universal and important to human children, then you'd expect to see more studies in which the loss of the father made a difference to child survivorship. In fact, if you look at the other relatives on the screen, more help may be coming from the child's grandmothers. The sample sizes here are getting a bit small, but in about 70% of cases, not a large sample size, but in about 70% of cases, the absence of the maternal grandmother increased child mortality rates. So if the maternal grandmother was around, the children survived better, which is about twice as many studies as you saw positive effects of fathers. Paternal grandmothers, in about 50% of cases, their presence improved child survivorship. Grandfathers didn't appear to matter too much. The presence of older siblings was correlated with better child survivorship in 5 out of 6 studies. So in percentage terms, it's the highest percentage of studies in which older siblings mattered, but it was a very small number of studies. I'm going through that quite briefly because I really want to talk about fertility rather than child survivorship, but I think this review of child survivorship suggests that mothers are getting help from other individuals. The absence of these relatives in many cases is increasing child mortality rates, but where that help comes from is quite variable, and it's certainly not universally coming from fathers. Okay, getting back to fertility, babies are a problem in another sense as well in terms of the human demographic literature. A rather puzzling thing about human fertility is how substantially it has declined in the last couple of centuries. Fertility has declined from relatively high levels of maybe 7 or so kids per woman down to much lower levels of fertility, to below replacement fertility, below 2 children per woman in industrialised societies. It's done that over the last couple of centuries. In developing countries too, most of these countries are also now going through the demographic transition. Their fertility rates are also declining. This universal fertility decline is also a puzzler problem for people working in demography. And the explanation for the demographic transition, the fertility decline, is undoubtedly multifactorial. There are many things going on. But a question that I'm interested in is whether kin are part of that answer. So I think kin are useful, are of interest rather, in terms of fertility rates, both to evolutionary biologists for these theoretical reasons about whether humans are cooperative breeders, but also for research such as demography and sociology in order to explain variation in fertility rates, particularly over time. So in order to speak to some of these questions, the 2 empirical questions that I'm going to tackle during this talk are, first of all, is there any empirical evidence that kin do influence reproductive outcomes? If humans are cooperative breeders, then you should see some evidence that kin are influencing fertility as they seem to influence child survivorship. The second question is, do these influences vary between populations? So let me take a step back for a moment and talk a bit about why kin would influence fertility. Now, one reason why kin would influence fertility is because they are providing this practical support and resources in order to subsidise women's reproduction. So they may be providing direct childcare, or they may be transferring economic resources or some kind of help and advice in some way in order to help women reproduce. But there are a couple of other reasons too why you may expect to see kin influences on fertility. Leslie Newson, for example, has suggested that kin may influence fertility through social interaction, social transmission. It's not just the practical support that kin are giving, because kin are generally going to encourage one another's reproduction in order to encourage reproductive success. Kin may be more pronatal than kin. They may give more pronatal messages, more pronatal advice than non-kin, if it's a good time for an individual to reproduce, that is. So where you have lots of kin around you, you might expect to see higher fertility rates because you're getting these social pressures, this social transmission as well to have kids to reproduce. A third reason why you may expect to see kin influences on fertility are indirect influences. One of these examples could be education. Parents are going to be investing in their children in a number of ways. As societies move towards a market education-based economy, you may expect to see parents encouraging their kids to invest in education in order to become competitive members of that economy. So if kin around you are influencing your education level, for example, you might also expect to see knock-on effects on fertility, because factors such as education are known to have clear influences on a woman's fertility rate. So there are also these indirect influences through which kin may affect fertility. And I'm hoping to explore some of these pathways of influence, as well as simply examining whether kin influence fertility in the work I'm doing at the moment. So the specific empirical evidence that I'm going to talk about in this talk will start off with an analysis of the effects of kin on fertility in two particular societies. That's work that I've done and a student of mine has done. I'm then going to talk about a review of the existing literature that I've done, so collating all of the information out there on whether kin influence fertility. And then I'm going to start to talk about the systematic comparative project I'm currently engaged in at the end of the talk. Okay, first of all, the Gambia. I've worked on a data set for the Gambia for quite some time now, since my PhD. This is a really nice data set to work with. It's been collected by the UK Medical Research Council since 1950, so we have a very long time depth of data. It's a very rich data set. We have demographic and genealogical data, but also anthropometric and health data. So it's a very useful data set for evolutionary anthropologists to work with. During the time that I was studying the influences of kin on fertility, that is, between 1950 and 1974, it was a subsistence agriculture population. And I'm restricting the analysis to the time period up to 1974, because in 1975 a medical clinic was set up in one of these villages, which had a very dramatic impact on the demography of these villages. So the time period I'm studying was also a natural fertility, natural mortality population. There wasn't much medical care and no access to contraception. And before I go on to fertility, just to talk briefly about child survivorship. This is one of the cases where you do see a clear influence of maternal grandmothers on child survivorship. This is the survival curve showing the survival of children over the first 5 years of life according to whether their maternal grandmother was alive or dead. And there's a clear survival advantage to kids whose maternal grandmothers are still alive. You don't see the effect for paternal grandmothers, you don't see this effect for fathers. So in this particular population, it's only the maternal grandmothers and also the elder sisters of the child, which I'm not showing you here, that improve child survivorship. This suggests at least there may be some kin interactions on reproductive outcomes going on. And to look at the influence of kin on fertility, again, you see effects of certain kin members on a woman's fertility. This time, not her own kin, not her own mothers. Her own mother and father had no influence on her rate of fertility, but her mother-in-law and her father-in-law did. If the mother-in-law or the father-in-law were around, the woman had shorter birth intervals than if they weren't around. This is taken from one of my papers showing this. Again, it's a survival plot, in this case, of the proportion of women who have a birth following the birth of a child. So it's an indication of the length of the birth interval. Women with mothers-in-law, the dotted line, have slightly shorter birth intervals. They have a slightly higher probability of birth per month after the birth of a child compared to women who don't have mothers-in-law around. These were quite small effects per birth interval, but averaged out over all of the birth intervals, they may have had a slightly more substantial effect. And this effect was seen both for mothers-in-law and fathers-in-law, so it's unlikely to be One potential explanation for this could be that mothers-in-law were easing the work burden of women and improving their nutritional status, for example. But because the effect was also seen for fathers-in-law, I'm not convinced by that explanation, because there's quite a sexual division of labour in this population, and it's women really that are doing the agricultural labour, not the men. It may be that there are social pressures going on here instead, that a woman's in-laws are pressurising her essentially to have children because it's a patrilineal society, they want to have kids for their patriline. That's an example in a subsistence agriculture community where you do see effects of kin on fertility. A student of mine, Paul Matthews, has looked in a very different population recently, the UK in the 1990s and more recently, to see if you see similar effects of kin on fertility in a very different, much lower fertility, lower mortality population. He used the British Household Panel Survey to answer this question, but with a slightly different way to answer the question. The information he had was on women's social networks. Women were asked, who are your 3 closest friends? And then they were asked whether any of these individuals were kin or not, what relationship these people were to the index member. Women who cited more kin in their social networks had earlier first births and shorter birth intervals than those who cited fewer kin in their social networks, and this was controlling for socioeconomic status. So this is a slightly different way of getting at the question, but again it suggests that there may be some kind of kin influence on reproduction in a very different kind of society. And I think it is important to replicate these kinds of studies in many different societies. We're a very diverse species, the human species. It is not safe to do a study in a single human population and then extrapolate it to all human populations, despite what perhaps some sections of the evolutionary behavioural science community think. You do need to replicate studies in a range of different societies in order to test whether what you're seeing is universal, and also to test whether there might be interesting variation in whatever phenomenon you happen to be studying. Can you predict variation in a particular behaviour based on ecology or environment, for example? So I think it's very important to take a comparative approach to pretty much whatever you're doing in the human evolutionary behavioural sciences. So that's why I'm taking a comparative approach here to the study of the effects of kin on fertility. I think you can read what's on the screen there. I don't need to go through that again. So what I'm going to talk about for the rest of the talk is whether these results can be generalised. Do you see similar patterns in other populations? What conclusions can we draw if we take a comparative approach to looking at the effects of kin on fertility? So the first thing I did to do this comparative approach was a systematic review of the existing literature on the effects of kin on fertility. I don't know if anybody here has done a systematic review, but it's a methodology that's being developed in order to introduce rigour into the review process, which can be a little bit hit and miss if you pick and choose the studies you're including in your review. So the idea is that you use a methodology that is transparent and replicable, so that if anybody else uses your methodology, they will come up with at least the same set of papers as you do, not necessarily the same conclusions. And I used a particular piece of software developed at the Institute of Education in London to manage this review. I don't want you really to read the details on that screen, you're not going to be able to anyway, but during the process of the systematic review, the methodology that we used resulted in initially about 13,500 potential papers that we could include in our review. But going through all of the steps of the systematic review that you need to go through, what we ended up with was a final corpus of 39 papers. So I'd suggest the systematic review process has been developed in much in medical science, in epidemiology, where it might be a really nice methodology to use to identify a fairly limited set of papers to perform meta-analysis on. I'd suggest that our experience perhaps suggests in the more social sciences, in anthropology, it's perhaps not the best methodology to use. So basically I've done this so you don't have to. I'm not really sure I would recommend a systematic review to anyone. Interesting process that it was to go through. But anyway, we ended up with a sample of 39 studies at the end of our systematic review process, all of which had looked at the impact of specific members of kin on a woman's fertility rate. These 39 studies came from a variety of demographic regimes, both high and low fertility, from quite a wide geographic range. From a mix of subsistence strategies, but mostly either agricultural or modern mixed economies. There were just one or two hunter-gatherer societies in there, for example. So mostly they were relatively complex societies. And we only included literature which had statistically correlated the availability of specific kin. In practice, that was either a woman's mother, her father, her mother-in-law, or her father-in-law, or parents-in-law without specifying mother or father, with female fertility outcomes. There is quite a lot of literature out there, as we discovered, on fertility and some aspect of kin and fertility that we have excluded from this review because we weren't really interested in it. For example, there's a big literature on intergenerational transmission of fertility, looking at whether a woman's fertility is correlated with that of her mother's, for example. We excluded that because we wanted to look at whether the actual presence of kin affected a woman's fertility during her reproductive life, rather than simply whether the number of kids a woman's mother had was correlated with the number of kids that she had had. So we did come up with papers on all of these topics during our systematic review, but we have excluded them from what I'm going to talk about for the next few minutes. The fertility outcomes we included were quite varied. Some of them were on woman's age at first birth. Some of them were just on teenage pregnancy, which we used as a proxy for early first birth. A lot of the studies in Western societies, for example, look at whether a woman had a teenage birth or not, an early birth. Some of the studies looked at length of birth intervals, some looked at total number of births. And the kin availability measures that we included were basically a woman's parents or parents-in-law. How they were measured, how the presence of these relatives were measured did vary a bit from study to study. Sometimes it was whether the relative was co-resident with the woman. Sometimes it was simply whether they were still alive or not when the woman was reproducing, which is a crude indicator, but it's still some kind of indicator of kin availability. This slide just talks about the descriptive stats of the 39 papers in this study. So they came from a wide geographical range. Some were historical, but most were from contemporary populations. Most were from relatively complex production systems. They were about evenly split between what I've called high and low fertility populations. I did divide up the analysis pretty arbitrarily into either high fertility populations where women had 3 or more kids, or low fertility populations where women had less than 3 kids on average. And I'm going to talk about that difference in a moment. But the papers were pretty much evenly split between those two types of study. Again, this is not something I'm showing so that you can read all the details on the slide, but this and the next slide show you the literature that we found. We came up with these 39 studies in a range of different populations. If anybody is familiar with the literature, these are the authors there. And then we classified them according to their fertility status, the fertility measure that was included in the study, and then the effects of mothers, fathers, mothers-in-law, and fathers-in-law. What you can take from that slide is these are the high fertility populations, so these are where women are having 3 or more kids on average. Actually, I can use the pointer, then I'll have my hands full. But on this side of the slide, you can see the effects of various kin on a woman's fertility outcome. If there's a plus, it means the presence of that relative increased her fertility. A minus, of which there are very few, but that would mean the presence of that particular relative decreased the woman's fertility. None means there was no statistical correlation. For the high fertility societies, what you can see is quite a lot of pluses on the screen. This is exactly the same information, but for the low fertility societies, here you see a lot more minuses on the screen. In fact, very few pluses at all. And I've graphed out this data, all of the data together to begin with, not divided into high and low fertility. So this is quite similar to the child survivorship slide that I showed you. This is the percentage of studies in which each of these different relatives had either a pronatal effect on fertility, that is an increase in fertility, an antenatal effect on fertility, or no effect on fertility in this corpus of 39 papers. And what you can see is that there is quite a lot of red and green on the slide. There are quite a lot of influences of kin on fertility. There's quite a lot of blue as well. I mean, there were quite a few studies where there was no statistical correlation, but for all of these relatives, the majority of studies did find some kind of influence of kin on fertility. Although there was some difference between the different kin types. So if you look at the parents-in-law, for example, there's more green than red. So parents-in-law tended to have a positive impact on fertility. Parents, it's a bit more evenly split between green and red, suggesting that parents may be sometimes pronatal, sometimes antenatal. But if you divide the same slide into high and low fertility societies, what you tend to see in, as the table showed you, in the high fertility societies, there's largely green on the slide. Where kin make a difference, they tend to be pronatal, they tend to increase fertility. Low fertility societies are quite different. Where kin have an influence, they tend to lower fertility, they have an antenatal effect. But the problem with the low fertility studies is that an awful lot of them are on teenage childbearing and age at first birth in these Western low fertility populations. And for that, we don't have any information on the mothers-in-law because often the fathers are not around for these very early births. So these women don't have, they had a partner at some point, but they don't have husbands necessarily. So we can't really look at the impact of parents-in-law in these low fertility papers. Parents in these low fertility societies actually seem to be having an antenatal effect. They slow down fertility, but again, this is because they're largely on age at first birth, teenage childbearing, and it's a very consistent effect that women whose fathers are absent or mothers are absent tend to have an earlier first birth than women who have present mothers and fathers. That's quite a consistent finding. So these studies are largely on a single fertility outcome, that's age at first birth. If you look at the high fertility societies, the fertility outcomes are much more varied. They're more often on things like length of birth intervals or total number of children. And I did want to look at that father absence thing in a bit more detail. Something else I'm working on at the moment, this is now work in process, is a review of the literature specifically on age at first birth. And how that differs according to father absence in different societies. You do have this consistent effect of the presence of the father increasing age at first birth in Western populations. People like Jay Belsky have assumed that this is a universal phenomena and it's to do with childhood conditions with and without the father. But I'm interested in this in non-Western populations because in the Gambia, for example, we did some work a while ago showing that women who had absent fathers actually had a later age at first birth than those whose fathers were present, which is the reverse of what you see in Western societies. It wasn't a hugely strong effect, which is why there's brackets around that plus there. But it did seem quite a consistent relationship. So what I've done in this table is to gather the information I could find on non-Western societies and the effects of father absence on age at first birth in these high fertility non-Western societies, the ones at the top. And here you see that if you have absent fathers, you actually tend to have a later first birth. There are some societies where you don't see any effect at all, including, actually no, Brooks, you did find a relationship. This is Brooks' study, incidentally, on Martu Aborigines. In a couple of studies, there was no statistical correlation between the absence of the father and age at first birth. But where there was a correlation, the absence of the father increased age at first birth, not decreased it, which is what you see in the West. The studies at the bottom of the screen, again, I should have said this is another review of the literature. The studies at the bottom of the screen are non-Western societies, but they're relatively low fertility. So these are ones moving through or which have moved through the demographic transition. And here you see the Western pattern. So Western studies usually come from the US and the UK because there are so many longitudinal studies and from those two particular populations. But if you look at other low fertility but non-Western populations, you see the same pattern. Father absence decreases age at first birth, which I think is quite an interesting finding. But the studies at the top of that screen certainly suggest that this delaying effect on age at first birth of father presence cannot be a human universal. It's not something common to all societies. However, it's being brought about and the mechanism may be different in these different societies. There is something different going on between these different societies. So to conclude the review part of this talk, the conclusions that I've drawn from reviewing the existing literature suggests that there are associations between kin availability and fertility. Many studies, not all, but many studies do find some kind of association between kin availability and some measure of fertility. And broadly speaking, parents-in-law are pronatal, they increase fertility. Parents may be pro or antenatal, depending on the type of society. But these fertility outcomes are quite variable. The kin indicators that are being used are also quite variable, so it's not terribly safe to draw any kind of conclusions from the literature as it stands. It's simply too variable. It's not consistent enough. It's not standardized enough. There are a number of other problems too with doing simply a review of the literature. These are just correlational studies. So the causal mechanism in most cases is not examined at all. It's simply a statistical association between some measure of kin availability and some measure of fertility. And of course you also have the file draw problem, where people are only publishing results which show some kind of effect. So people who haven't found an effect between kin availability and fertility may simply have not published their work. There are also problems with the data, the studies that were included in the review. They may under or overestimate kin effects. For example, some of the studies included are on nationally representative samples, which may involve quite a lot of subpopulations within them. You may see different effects in different subpopulations. The US is a good example here. You know, it's a very large population. There's quite a lot of variation in terms of socioeconomic status and ethnicity. So looking at a nationally representative US sample may be hiding a lot of interest. Not all studies are independent data points. There are several studies in there from the US and the UK, which are not going to be independent data points. So in fact, graphing them out in the way I did is a bit misleading. And also the measurement of fertility and kin varies between studies. Another problem with analysing the fertility literature is understanding what a pro or antenatal effect actually means. When it comes to child survivorship, it's fairly clear that child survivorship is a good thing in terms of reproductive success. There may be a few exceptions, but broadly speaking, child survivorship is good for one's reproductive success. A woman is going to be trying to increase the survivorship of her children. Her kin around her are probably going to be doing the same thing. With fertility, it's not that clear-cut. In fact, having many closely spaced children is probably not good for women because of maternal depletion. And it may be that the reasons why we see more effects of parents-in-law than parents on, for example, length of birth interval, is that a woman's parents are concerned with her own health as well as the health of her children. A woman's parents-in-law are going to be concerned about the grandchildren, less so about the woman herself because she's not genetically related to them. So it is a bit tricky also to interpret the fertility literature because a pronatal effect is not necessarily one which is going to result in an overall increase in reproductive success. So there are all kinds of problems with the existing literature. What I'm doing at the moment is a research project funded by the European Research Council to try and look at the influence of kin on fertility much more systematically. So I want to use very similar methods across a wide range of different populations in order to provide more convincing evidence of whether kin do influence fertility. I also want to explore the pathways through which kin may influence fertility in order to be certain that it is some direct influence of kin rather than some indirect effect that we're picking up on. I want to do this at the individual level in a number of different populations, but I also want to do a comparative population level analysis ultimately to try and predict why kin may matter in some situations but not others. So can we somehow test the prediction, for example, that parents-in-law are going to be more pronatal than parents at the population level? That's the overall project. I've only just recently got started on it, but I can give you some just preliminary results from the first stage of this project. So this is Kristen Snopkowski. She was one of Hilly Kaplan's graduate students. She's now a postdoc of mine in Durham, and she started on the first stage of this project, which is to do a comparative analysis of the demographic and health survey data. DHS surveys are a very rich source of data. They're surveys which have been collected across the developing world since the 1980s, and they're all easily downloadable at the click of a button, which is one of the big advantages for anybody doing research in this area. You have to register, but they're completely open access to university researchers. The project is still ongoing, so a number of countries now have a number of different DHS surveys. They're not longitudinal, they're all cross-sectional surveys, but some countries do now have several. They're large sample sizes. The sample size varies between about 5 and 30,000 households. They're designed to be nationally representative samples. If they are conducted more than once in a country, typically they'll be done every 5 years. The idea behind them is that they use relatively standardised methods, so you have quite similar data from a range of different populations. So they should be ideal for the kind of project I want to do here. They're very rich in data. They're very thick questionnaires. They collect really vast amounts of data. Here are some of the topics that will be relevant to me, but there are many other topics as well that could be useful in these demographic and health surveys. They're quite underutilised by evolutionary anthropologists too. David Lawson at UCL is now starting to use them, but they're a very rich source of data that have been quite underutilised in the anthropological community. What I want to use these DHS to do is to explore these associations systematically between kin availability and fertility and look at the pathways through which kin may influence fertility. Just want to highlight one of the advantages of these data sets. These are the data sets which Kristen has found which have relevant information on kin outcomes and fertility outcomes. What you see in the table there is their sample sizes. In total, we have 60,000 women that we can look at the effects of kin on fertility, which for an anthropologist is a really nice sample size. So one of the big advantages of these data sets is simply sheer sample size. This particular data set is quite nice because it also has a range of different fertility levels, which will allow us to look at whether these effects are similar or different across different stages of the demographic transition. So most of these data sets that Kristen is using were collected during the 1980s. These are those, I can't quite remember how many countries it is, it's about 10 countries have the relevant information. These are the fertility levels of these countries which have the relevant information on kin and fertility over time. And in the 1980s, they really begin to widen out quite conveniently for our particular project. So our particular project will have data from countries where fertility isn't much above 2, such as Thailand, and where it's still something like 7 children per woman in Burundi. So we have quite a nice variation in fertility levels too. And so these are the variables that we can use to look at the impact of kin on fertility in demographic and health surveys. We have a number of different fertility variables. We also have a number of different kin variables. Some of the data sets simply have the survival status of these kin, whether the mother or mother-in-law was alive or dead at the time of the interview. Some also have that information at the time of marriage, though, so we do have some kind of longitudinal measure of kin survival status too. We also have household data, so we know who is co-resident with a particular woman. And in order to start exploring these pathways of influence, what Kristen has begun to do is not simply to correlate the presence of kin with certain outcomes, but also to use path analysis to try and explore these pathways of influence. And some of the potential pathways of influence that we have data on in the DHS include child outcomes. For example, if kin are improving child survivorship, this could have a knock-on effect on fertility. Also contraceptive use, a lot of these populations are now using contraception, so we can see whether kin have influences on a woman's contraceptive uptake, and there's some other research that suggests they do. We also have variables on things like socioeconomic status, but also education, to see whether kin influences are acting through education. And this is just one of the early path analysis diagrams that Kristen drew up. So we have the kin availability indicators in there, whether the parents are alive or dead. We can have a look at the pathways through which those kin may be having influences, such as contraceptive knowledge, education and child survivorship, to ultimately see whether these kin are having an influence on fertility outcomes and reproductive success. So I'm just going to run through some very preliminary results from 3 particular demographic and health surveys that Kristen has started to analyse. These are 3 quite different DHS surveys. In here we have Burundi, where the TFR was still 7 when the survey was taken in 1987. In Africa, we have an Asian data set from the same year, but where the TFR was very much lower. We also have some data on Bolivia from the 1980s, where fertility was somewhat intermediate. Bolivia is in brackets because Kristen hasn't yet started doing the path analysis, but she has done some other preliminary work. And what she started to do was to simply correlate the presence of kin, mother, father, mother-in-law, father-in-law, with these different fertility outcomes in the 3 different surveys. Again, these are going to be hard to read, but I've highlighted the significant results on the screen there in different colours for different types of kin. So if it's yellow, it's a woman's parents. If it's green, it's a woman's parents-in-law. These are controlling for things like SES, but they don't control yet for the pathways of influence, these particular regression models. And somewhat encouragingly, you immediately do see some effects of kin on these fertility outcomes. So, for example, particularly on age at first marriage, which is going to be related to age at first birth, though not totally, you do see effects of all kin members in pretty much all these three populations. If you look at total number of children born too, you see some effects in some populations. Average birth intervals, there's only one effect of mothers-in-law in Thailand. This are the correlations that Kristen has done between, again, the kin availability indicators, but here the potential pathways of influence. This is not a path analysis yet. This is simply correlating these potential intermediate factors with the kin availability. Here there seems to be somewhat less going on, somewhat less encouragingly. Again, I've highlighted the significant results. Incidentally, the significant results don't control for the fact that she's done lots of tests, so this is all quite a crude analysis at the moment. But there are some correlations between certain kin members and certain of these potential intermediate factors. For example, contraceptive knowledge and contraceptive use in Thailand. But to go on to the path analysis that she has done for first Burundi and then Thailand, she has run a preliminary path analysis with the Burundi data. If you can read that, the results are actually at the top there. So what she found is that mothers-in-law have a negative impact on birth intervals, which leads to an increase in the total number of children born. Parents, both mothers and fathers, actually increase age at first birth, however, which decreases the total number of children born. Fathers-in-law have no effect. And in this particular model, there wasn't any education in the path analysis because not enough of the women in Burundi had sufficient education. There was some education in Thailand. Here the results are a little bit different. Again, the take-home message is at the top there. Mothers-in-law here have a negative impact on birth intervals, but a positive impact on age at marriage and education, which leads to a slightly negative impact on total number of children born overall. Mothers and fathers have a positive impact on education, which leads to fewer children overall because of the correlation between female education and fertility. And again, fathers-in-law have no effect. So what these I should emphasise, by the way, that these are very preliminary results. What these preliminary results suggest, again, is that we do see kin effects in these demographic and health surveys, as we've seen in other populations. Mothers-in-law have a positive effect on fertility. That means they increase fertility in the high fertility population of Burundi, but they lower fertility in Thailand. Parental effects are negative in both populations, despite the fact they have very different levels of fertility. However, I am going to describe them both as transitional populations. In Burundi as well as Thailand, there is some evidence of a decline in fertility, as you saw from a previous screen. What I'm concluding from this and the other research that I've talked about so far, and I emphasise this is very preliminary, this is really far too early to conclude, but it seems that it's not just that kin are becoming less important as societies move through the demographic transition, as you move from a high to a low fertility population, but kin effects may actually be flipping in direction. So in high fertility, pre-transition, traditional populations, kin tend to increase fertility where they have an effect at all. In post-transition, low fertility societies, kin actually seem to be decreasing fertility, largely because they seem to increase age at first birth, perhaps because they're encouraging investment in children's educational capital, embodied capital in Kaplan's terms. And this is having a knock-on effect of lowering their fertility rates. So I think it may not just be a reduction in kin effects, which is different between traditional and modern societies, but actually a flip in the direction of the kin effect. The problem with that conclusion is that you see these negative parental effects in Burundi, even though women still have 7 kids on average. At least older women are still having quite high fertility rates. So I do emphasise this really is much too early to make any of these conclusions, but this is what the data is telling me so far, at least. There is more work to be done, and I'm going to continue this project over the next few years with the help of one of your graduate students, who I'm very pleased is going to be joining me in London. So the next step is to do a comparative of small-scale anthropological studies. So to do something similar to what Kristen is doing with these big demographic surveys, but to work with much smaller scale anthropological data sets, which may have more different types of data in terms of the pathways of influence of kin, for example. And this is a project which is being run out of the Santa Fe Institute. Monique Bergerhoff Mulder and Sam Bowles got together about 20 or so anthropologists 4 years ago to work on a project on the intergenerational transmission of wealth, a project that was published in Science a couple of years ago. And this consortium of researchers is still in existence. We're now taking the project in different directions, and one of the things that we're hoping to do is to look at the effects of relational wealth on reproductive success with these data sets. Again, that will be at the individual level, but when we've done all this individual level analysis in the large-scale demographic data sets and the small-scale anthropological data sets, then the final stage of the project will be to do this population level analysis, where the population is the unit of analysis, not the individual, to test predictions about when kin should matter and why that should be. Just very finally, another way I want to try and get at these issues of kin influence on fertility and the pathways by which kin influence fertility is to do some more psychological studies, if you like, on how kin may influence fertility. So my ex-PhD student, Paul Matthews, is about to start a postdoc in Essex, and he has got a question ordering experiment into one of the large UK longitudinal data sets. It used to be called the British Household Panel Survey. It's now become the Understanding Society Survey, in order to see whether reminding people about their kin and their social networks has any influence on their fertility preferences. That's the Understanding Society survey. This is now a very large survey. I forget exactly how many households it includes. It's something like 20,000 households, I think, so this is a very large-scale data collection exercise. What Paul has proposed, and the proposal has been accepted, in fact I think the first wave of data has now been collected, is that in this survey you have two different types of questionnaire. In one questionnaire, people are given questions about their kin and their social networks before they're asked about their fertility preferences. The other version of the questionnaire, the two sets of questions are reversed. So people are asked about their fertility preferences before they're reminded about or asked questions about their kin and their social networks. The idea behind this is to see if making people think about your kin and your social networks actually increases your fertility preferences. And Paul has already done a similar experiment, not on kin and fertility, but on mortality salience and fertility. So as part of his PhD, he did precisely this using an internet experiment. It wasn't in one of these large-scale surveys. He used an internet experiment to look at the effects of mortality salience and fertility preferences. Again, with this question ordering experiment. So some people he asked questions about death, generic questions like, what is the mortality rate, child mortality rate in the UK, that kind of thing, but made to think about mortality and death in some way. Before they were asked about their fertility preferences, the control group had exactly the same questionnaire, but with those two sets of questions reversed. So they're asked about their fertility preferences before, made to think about death. And what happens is that if you make men think about death, their fertility preferences increase. It doesn't work for girls, but if you make men think about mortality, then they want to have more kids, which is what Paul predicted on the basis of life history theory, because if you're in a high mortality environment, you ought to have a higher reproductive rate. It possibly holds for males more than females because they may have more labile fertility preferences, but this has been replicated now in two different samples by Paul. There are also a couple of other studies from terror management theory, and there's a whole body of theory in psychology on mortality salience, which actually shows the same thing. You make men think about death, they want to have more kids. Doesn't seem to have the same effect on women. So this, I think, is quite encouraging, and I'm hoping we're going to see some nice results from this much larger scale, nationally representative study in the UK to see whether there could be any psychological mechanisms which explain why kin may be having some influence on fertility. And those are my acknowledgements. I think that's all I have to say this morning. Thank you very much.